Good afternoon, everybody. This is Andrea Cumston with the Enterprise Wireless Alliance. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Taking Advantage of New Opportunities at 800 Megahertz. Today's speakers are EWA's President and CEO, Robin J. Cohen, and the Chief Strategy Officer for EWA, Mark
I know it's
Crosby. I know.
mouthful.
And with that, I'm turning it over to them for today's session.
Want me to start?
Well, I think it's a good idea for you to start because, first of all, I wasn't even at EWA yet. I was in the middle of the thick of rebanding in 2009 when this idea came about and the filing started. So why don't you begin with that?
I'll be happy. Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. Thank you for everybody that's on the call. And, we got to start. What's the basis, right? How did this all come about? I was attending a vendor event, and there was a lot of people, and they were discussing forthcoming products. And one of the speakers was talking about forthcoming products at 800 megahertz. I was in the audience, and they were using, and on the screen, emission designators that were, thin, narrow, and they were going to apply this to 800. So I sit there and I'm going to use just for illustrative purposes. The 800 megahertz channels back in 2009 or 8 were all 25 kilohertz, of course. And the new technologies, the digital technologies, were less than 10 kilohertz, many of them. And so you just sit there, many artists going, wait a minute, are you going to start putting, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 emission designators in 25 kilohertz channels? We're wasting spectrum, a lot of spectrum. So the thought came to EWA, we should petition the FCC to permit the use of adjacent or offset or interstitials, however you want to call them, next to the 25s, because eventually the folks that are operating on 25 kilohertz channels with old analog technology or end-of-life products, or operating technologies that are not like 4 voice pass per 21 kilohertz or whatever, like Tetra or other ones. There's very few Tetra systems at 800 today. There are some other, but there's the clear majority of systems at 800 are 20. But if they're going to migrate to things narrower, this creates an opportunity to use the 12.5 kilohertz channels to a greater extent. So we filed a petition for rulemaking in 2009. Now you might, this is a lesson, I'm not picking on the FCC, but look how long it's taken to get where we are, and we're not even done yet, right? We're not even done yet. But in 2009, EWA filed a petition for rulemaking suggesting that we could make better use of 800 megahertz by because some of the new technologies would adapt very well to the 12.5 kilohertz channels. 6 years later, the FCC goes, yeah, maybe it's a good idea. And they issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. And then there was a couple of people, coordinators, who were a little concerned about some of the details, but we worked our way through it. And the commission eventually issued an order creating 12.5 kilohertz channels at 800 megahertz. Okay, so that's still like almost 2 years ago. And then, as we usually do, EWA, we get anxious because we're going, everything's sort of done. What are you waiting for? And in July of last year, we filed a request to saying, hey, FCC, you need to issue an application acceptance date because the industry perhaps can make good use of these channels, and the coordinators ought to know when they could have. Of course, we didn't hear from them. January 22nd, we said, well, we'll change our tack. Instead of asking for an acceptance date, go, why don't you release the channel, the 12.5, just a different tenor, different approach. And we've now learned that the rules of matrix, all the rules are in place. They've been in place for about 2 years. So the only thing left is to release the channels. And so we've had lately, and Robin will cover this, I think, a little bit later in the presentation, some very productive conversations among the coordinators and with the FCC, both bureaus, and how we can launch the use of these channels. And probably later today, the National Wireless Communications Council and all the coordinators will submit to the commission so they could put it in a public notice of what the pre-coordination process will be. It's pretty simple, and we'll cover it later. But I think one more thing, if we're, every time we're going to use a band and try to promote technology and greater use, the frequency coordination aspect will get considerably more complicated. This isn't overly complicated, but it is somewhat complicated. Next slide. And you'll see as we get, now listen, this, everybody, we've done this a couple times. You know, adding the yellow channels are the new interstitials. I don't even call them interstitials because when an applicant comes to EWA, they're not going to say, I want interstitial channels only. Oh, I only want 25 kilohertz channels. Applicants and vendors selling systems are going to go, we need 800 channels. I don't care whether it's 12 and a half or 25. The only people that would care are people selling technologies that have, selling systems that have emission designators that are greater than 12 and a half. Then you have to, but we would know that anyway as a
Right.
coordinator.
We would know that on the.
We're going to look at the emission designator, and if it says 15, guess what? 15 is bigger than 12 and a half. It ain't going to fit, right? So we got to look at 21.
And when we
But
get requests, we run the entire band anyway.
we're going to run them all anyway, because essentially they're all the same, except that the blue one can accommodate all emission designators. The yellow one, the interstitials as evidenced here, accommodate emission designators 11 and less. Now, the only thing this doesn't show is that there also are technologies and opportunities to put multiple voice paths inside the blue, the 25 kilohertz, depending on the combiner and stuff. So you don't have to use interstitials, but there are some emission designators and systems that you can put 2 or 3 channels within a 25.
And some folks are already doing that today.
Right.
They'll have, as an example, 7K and 21K on their license to show that they're using all of their 25 kilohertz channel.
Exactly. But everybody who's on the thing, go back one more time, should see this. So somebody might ask the question, well, this is great. So the migration to narrower band technologies at 800 is sort of an option. You might ask, at some point, is the commission going to make 12 and a half or less narrow band requirements at 800? There's nothing on the table now. We haven't heard anything from the FCC that they're going to require people operating 20K emission designators, that they're going to need to migrate to narrower technologies.
And if they did, it might take another 13 years, right?
Well, yeah, I know, but I think it might happen as a matter of course.
Right.
Because that's why if you get these out and you send your applications to EWA, we're going to be able to weed through all this and go, oh, here's your emission designator. Here are the incumbents are using this emission designator. These are the channels that are in play. These channels aren't in play. And, but I don't think the commission at this point is contemplating some sort of narrowband directive at 800. I think it'll happen as a matter of course. And also at 800, there are a lot of technologies that you'll see later based emission designator. So, I don't, if you're all thinking about that, I'm not aware of you. I'm not aware of anything that may force a migration.
There has been no conversations that
Right.
I'm aware of.
We have new rules,
We do.
and that's your jurisdiction.
I don't even know if they can be considered new. They've been in Part 90 for the past 2 years. We just haven't been able to implement any of them. So the 12 and a half kilohertz channels, there's 318 new channels included in the band plan for 800 megahertz. It's in the tables. So, it consists of the 25 kilohertz channels that we all know and love for all these years, and now these new 318 channels. They do have pool allocations, just like the 25 kilohertz channels. They're all interleaved, just like, you know, the band has been between 854 and 861 for quite some time. The analysis that the coordinators will be running is still the standard distance calculation. And, you know, a lot of you are probably like, well, what does that mean? You know, the initial, you know, Mark and I were talking about this earlier, the initial flush test that we look at is it clear for 70? And then the short spacing table comes into play, you know, between 55 and 70. And the only time the matrix, which is newly introduced into Part 90 of the FCC's rules, the only time the matrix is applied is if you want to get closer than the rules permit, which is closer than 55 miles.
And that's an adjacent channel.
It's an adjacent
Oh.
channel analysis. It's a reciprocal analysis, forward and back between 12.5 and 25 kilohertz channel that have incumbent stations on them today. And the calculations, much like the rules, this last bullet point isn't necessarily a new rule. It's based off of, you know, maximum permitted ERP along with, you know, licensed antenna heights, et cetera. And the 25 kilohertz were analyzed, you know, with those same ERP and antenna height calculations.
Let me add here. I remember significant discussions within the Land Mobile Communications Council on the third bullet here. Some of the coordinators, when Robin says it's reciprocal, when you fail an adjacent channel distance calculation, the distance to get permission to do it, you apply the matrix and there's contours, but it's a two-way. We have to, the proposed system must protect incumbents, adjacent channel incumbents, if you're less than 55 miles. And this was a point of contention. An incumbent has a contour based on emission designators. And if the proposal goes, they're getting no interference, no overlap from, but the other way there is, like, so the incumbent's causing potentially overlapping, causing interference to the proposed, we don't want the guys, oh, I'll take the interference. Right. We go, no, we're not going to certify the app because I'm perfectly willing to get blown off the air by the incumbent. And
well, and the rules don't allow us to certify it because that's why the commission implemented this reciprocal analysis. It's the 12 and a half against the 25, and then the reverse is the 25
exactly
back up against the 12 and a half.
There's two things. One,
Right.
Contour to the incumbents, adjacent channel, and from the incumbents to the proposed.
Right.
And so when I said the coordination process, anytime you promote new technology, it's going to get more complicated. You'll see later on. And to certify one channel at 800, and regardless of whether it's 12 and a half, 12 and over 25, how many channels do you need to clear?
3, which we're going to cover later in additional slides. But the way I look at it, given the fact that I've been working with 800 for, I think, almost my entire career so far, is a lot of people probably remember the offsets that were in the Mexican border region. It was the same thing. All coordinators had to look at 3 frequencies for every one.
Right.
And it's bringing that back, you know, and a lot of people are like, well, we just got rid of offsets, you know, with rebanding. Well, they're back. So.
Yeah, this is formal. We'll get to the matrix later, but we didn't put the matrix in the presentation because you all would hang up on us. So
It's very complicated, but you also wouldn't be able to see it.
yeah.
I know that in previous webinars, and Mark and I, when we give presentations, we've had it on a slide, and a lot of people are like needing like a magnifying glass or whatever, or a zoom lens to be able to see it because it's pretty
Yeah, the
complicated.
board members would scold us for going, why did you put that on the screen? No one, I said, I'm sorry, terribly sorry. All right. The coordination process.
Coordination process. So this is what we were just talking about. So every 3 channels that you look at. So it could, you know, it's the 12 and a halves and the 25s. We gave you the standard green, yellow, red light. Green is if it's greater than, you know, if it clears for 70 miles, 113 kilometers at whatever ERP the tables permit, so up to 1,000 watts, we can pass it and we can certify it. And you can today. even on 25s. Yellow means, caution. We have to apply the short spacing table that's been in the rules for many decades on adjacent and co-channels. And what that means is any stations that fall, existing licenses that fall between 55 and 70 have to be protected in accordance with this table, which takes into consideration heights along with ERPs. If it fails that, it fails and you move on, we move on to the next frequency. And all this that we're talking about, we don't expect you all to know and understand a lot of this. We just want you to know the basics, because this is what's going on behind the scenes here at EWA when the team is reviewing and recommending channels to you. There's a lot of work on the back end to be able to recommend channels.
No, go for it.
The last bullet is the key part that's fairly, part of it's new. So where there's red, meaning you can't go any further unless you apply the matrix, which means if there are incumbents less than 55, so less than 88 kilometers away, you have two options. You can get a consent letter from that entity, or you can ask us to apply the matrix. And that's where we can, I was telling Mark this earlier, I look at it as kind of shoehorning in, to allow a new entity to come in up against an existing licensee, narrower, so you both can coexist and not cause any interference to each other.
So I have a question that some people on the call may have. So applicants are gonna come to us and they go, I need 800 megahertz channel. You don't need to ask whether I need a 12.5 or 25. You just come and go, I need a 25 kilohertz channel.
Right.
I need a channel at 800 megahertz. Just find me one. Because at the end of the day, if you're using a digital technology, more than likely, it's not relevant whether it's a 12.5 or 25 authorized bandwidth channel. You don't care. Just give me the channel. The distance calculation that's green, yellow, and red is applied co-channel. Channel is going to be certified, and the two adjacent channels, one that's medial up and one that's medial down. So the step one is the spectrum management staff at 800. When you ask for 800, we'll do a distance calculation. Co-channel, channel is potential certified, and one channel up and one down. If it passes green or yellow, you're done. You get the channel.
Right.
You're good. If it's red and co-channel, you have to get concurrence or a waiver.
Right.
The chances of getting that waiver granted before your 80th birthday is probably very slim.
And that's been in the rules
I
for
know.
decades.
I'm just trying to make it clear, because people are going to go, when do you apply to matrix? When do you apply to matrix? If you pass the distance separation, co-channel and adjacent channel, you get a green or yellow, you get a channel.
Right.
If it fails co-channel, you got to get concurrence, or you move on to another channel.
Right.
If it passes co-channel, but fails adjacent channel, either up or down, then we apply the matrix, but only, and we'll get to this, if you ask us to, because it's not cheap. I mean, it could be cheap, it depends. But we have to do a Longley Rice or an R660 contour.
There's a lot of mapping
to do it. So it may be worth it. We'll get to this. May be worth it in instances where you go, oh my God, the guy that's blocking me is 49 miles away. I would recommend do the matrix for an adjacent channel. If it passed co-channel and we do the contours based on this and the adjacent channel, the chances are you're very good that you're going to get it. So that's sort of, it's complicated. Yep. There's a lot of words.
And one of the other things I was telling Mark earlier when we were talking this out is, there could be that the incumbent, there could be like multiple incumbents that are less than 55 miles away from your proposed location. So every single one, the contour, the matrix needs to be applied against. But as soon as the very first one fails, you move on to we move on to the next frequency, because as soon as one fails, it's done. You're done.
My My instincts tell me how we're going to roll this out is you won't know any difference. Our applicants won't know any difference. Because the process is pretty simple and it's the same, except that we're looking at 3 channels now, 1 channel to get 1.
Right.
And we will apply the matrix, but only if the applicant asks us to. Because why would you ask us to do 50 contours and your chances of getting one of them passed is 0? We don't want to do that to you. So you have to.
And we wouldn't recommend it either. The team is going to be looking at the incumbents' licenses to look at their existing emissions, how far away from your site they're going to be. Because if they're like 5 miles away, obviously, it's not going to work. So we're going to move on to the next one, and we're not even going to like recommend that. So there is that level of detail that the team is going to be looking at to even make those recommendations to you.
Yeah, so I think the point is it's more complicated by a factor of 3 because you have to do the distance on 3 channels to get 1.
Right.
What makes it more complicated is if you really want an adjacent channel, you really want this channel, and there's 1 or 2 incumbents, adjacent channel incumbents that are in the way, and it looks like basin missing designators, you're not going to cause them any problem. Reciprocal, and they're not going to cause you any problem. Then we'd probably go, let's apply the matrix, look at the contours, do some things with your power and elsewhere, and probably can get these channels certified for you.
Right. The matrix, this is what, so the crux of what's part of the new rules with the reciprocal adjacent channel analysis. Again, this is, as the first bullet says, to promote better spectrum utilization. And it's to, we're not getting any more new spectrum. And this introducing these channels and with new digital technologies, some that are narrower than others, are going to permit you to get, to coexist with these incumbent licensees that have already been out there. And, eventually there's going to be people licensed on these 12.5s, that in the data, and it's going to be part of our standard analysis. It's just going to be interesting how it works going forward. But the matrix, like we mentioned, is a reciprocal analysis. The proposed, the 12.5 up against the existing 25 kilohertz channel, and then in return, the 25 against the 12.5. And if that fails, either way, it fails that frequency and we move on to the next one. The interstitial channels, the 12.5 kilohertz channels that were put into the band plan also have pool allocations. And what that means is, today it's all interleaved. There's public safety channels, there's BILT, there's SMR channels. There's also some general category. And the interstitial channels have pool allocations as well. And by reviewing and looking at how the commission split it up, they essentially, like if you have a public safety channel that starts on a 25 kilohertz channel and you have the 12.5 on each side, the northern side, the upper side could be, is going to be public safety, but the lower side, the lower 12.5 is going to be, could be SMR or BILT.
So who gets to coordinate the interstitial in that circumstance?
In that circumstance, well, it depends on which one. Right. The one above.
Yeah.
So if it's a BILT applicant that's requesting the interstitial, that is a BILT interstitial frequency, the BILT coordinator, EWA, can certify it today. But if
No,
it
not
falls,
today, not till the
well, not
commission.
today, but until the commission releases it. But if it's public safety, that's where you have to get, we would have to get blessing from a public safety coordinator. And intercategory sharing rules apply, and it gets complicated.
So let me add this in here. Most of you go, but there's got to be people on this
Oh, I'm sure.
that are going, why
What
do
does
I
that all
have to
mean?
know? They go, why do I have to know all this?
Yeah.
And the answer is you don't have
You
to know
don't.
all of it.
But these are
We have
factors.
to know
it
all of it. So that's
to
why.
make recommendations.
Exactly. We're just saying this is what we're going to be going through. So you submit application, I want 800 channels, and you come back and go, why couldn't I get those three? We're gonna go, well, that's because they're right next to the public safety pool and only public safety can do those. And we can't get access until all the channels are used up in that area and the category sharing and everything else.
It's exactly how it is today. The fact that it has, we have different pools today. There's different pools when they allow us to start coordinating on the 12 and a half. So,
And who-
we can only coordinate what we can coordinate. And
Where the
that's-
12 and a halves fall in between the pools and everything. I can't imagine anyone out there at Big 800s go, I'm going to keep track of this, right? Let us keep track of it.
Right.
And again, just so I need 3 channels on Mount, on whatever, Mount Smith. And we'll do all this. We'll do all of this and we'll call you when we go, cannot find one unless, but there is 2 that look like good prospects. Jason, the Jason telling users in the way, you should authorize us to do the matrix so we can get a go or no go. Because where you are and at what power your level are, you're probably the only one that can get it. But we have to verify it using the matrix. So we'll listen, it'll take a little bit more communications for a while, but this isn't for the faint of heart. I was just talking to a court.
I know, right before this, literally 10 minutes before the webinar started, Mark was talking to another coordinator and educating him on this.
Well, because I guess we're going to cover that. Yeah, we're working on the pre-coordination protocols. And EWA tends to facilitate the drafting of these things and submittal to the FCC, et cetera. And I got a call from a coordinator and goes, what is this all about? I go, well, this has to do with the new channels that are coming out 12 and a half. And before you know it, I was answering questions of what happened to the 25s and what happened to the interstitials. And I go, no, those are the 12 and a halves. What's the problem? Why am I signing on to this? And I've given away our core competency during this call, but listen, if some of the coordinators are confused about this, just know that we are not. So
it is complicated.
It is, but we have a handle on it.
We have a handle on it.
We have a handle on it.
Much like Mark was saying earlier, and he's going to talk about that in I think the next slide related to the emission designators and why they're crucial to the frequency selection when EWA is performing the analysis. The matrix, again, we didn't include it in these slides because it would be really hard to see. But if you're that curious, it's actually in section 90.621, D as in David. And it basically tells the coordinators what, DBU contour to run.
D-rated contours.
Yep, D-rated contours to run each way. So there's 2 tables, 12 and a half to 25 and 25 back to the 12 and a half. So.
But remember, it's going to be used virtually if you ask and if we need it, no matter what the bandwidth of the channel. So for illustrative purposes, do look at 90.621D. You'll get about halfway through it and you'll go, okay, that's enough. Each matrix has going vertically, this is what's proposed. And there's emission designators. And listen, this was done, we went to every manufacturer and said, please tell us the emission designators that you have certified, your equipment certified for, that you sell and deploy at 800 megahertz. And there's like, the first one is proposed to incumbents. So the proposed down the vertical is all the emission designators, and on the top is the incumbents. Now, why it makes a difference is you might be 12 and a half and that's 25, or you might be 12 and a half and that's 25 going. So it's almost it's not 3-dimensional, but it sure as heck looks 3-dimensional. But if you go, oh, this is where this guy's in the way and this is what I'm proposing, and you go to the box and it tells you this is the derating factor against that thing, you need to run a contour against it. That's half of the matrix. The other side of the matrix is here's the incumbent to what's proposed.
Right.
That's the reciprocal. Right. So the matrix is, if you printed it out, normal thing is like 8.5 by 14, and there's 2 of them going and coming.
And it has a lot of emission designators in it,
yeah.
But believe it or not, it doesn't have all of them. We thought that the LMCC, now NWCC, when we reached out to the different manufacturers to make sure we had a full list, It
Oh, that's
doesn't have,
there's a-
all of them.
Well,
And so the NWCC, it has the majority of them, the key ones, but the NWCC specifically requested the FCC to not include it
That's right.
in the FCC's rules.
don't put this in the rules.
Just so it can be updated in the future, as new technologies come out. And the commission didn't agree with the NWCC, and that's why it is placed in the rules.
We didn't want even counsel. Liz said, don't let them do this, Mark. Right? There's nothing I could do. They put this matrix in the rules.
Right.
And of course, now the problem is, didn't you see that when we started this rule change, 2007, 2009? So if we go to the commission, the matrix is out of date because a couple of the vendors have come out with new technologies and you have to update the matrix.
Right.
And there's no expedited means to update the matrix. So we have this one. This is a slide. These are legitimate emission designators. We've done a whole webinar on emission designators only, because one of the most misunderstood things in this industry is emission designators. What one did we use last week? And then throw that one in there. Well, to maximize the use of 800 megahertz, the emission designators become a crucial element of the frequency coordination process. There are two analog emission designators. These are all real. Two analog emission designators here.
This is where Mark wished that we could actually see who's all on the call, because he has fun like picking on people to see if they know
So the
what they are.
20 KO F3E is analog and the 16 KO F3E is analog. All the other ones are digital. And this isn't all of them, because I think one of the public safety coordinators, that he says there's flaws in the matrix. And I go, what's wrong? He goes, one of them is supposed to have a G instead of an F. And I go, okay, but I think we'd be able to figure that out, right? But this is true. So if you look at this is why we put this in here. There's Tetra in here. The 22K is a Tetra. Obviously that requires a 25 kilohertz channel. I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence, but if you have 14, 16 or greater, you're not going to be on a 12.5 kilohertz channel. Only the 11K F things and the 9 and the 8 and the 7 and the 4Ks will work on a 12.5 kilohertz.
So if we get an application in-house that has anything with 14 or higher,
Right.
we will only be looking at the 25 kilohertz channel.
Unless the applicant, and this happens, comes
Right.
back and go, I wanted a 12.5. And we go, your emission designator does not permit it.
Right.
And believe me, y'all, we get those calls. Why won't it? I said, because listen, you can ask David Reeves. I'm the least technical when it comes to stuff, but even I know that if your equipment is going to have be authorized for 12.5, but the actual use of the channel, operational use is like 9, that'll work. Because that fits. The lane is wide enough for your Mini Cooper or whatever.
Right.
But this is only about I don't know, half of the emission designators that we have found to be certified at 800 megahertz. We suspect, and some of these are public safety oriented. I think the 9K and the 18K and 70K are public safety. Majority of the industrial business are 11, 7 and 4K. But again, if you got to supply EWA when you come to 800 now, and this means even for any channel, we
Right.
need the right emission designator or frequencies that could potentially be certified for your use. We won't know because the emission designator is too fat and it won't fit, and channels that we could certify will be taken off the table. So please be very specific about your emission designators, especially if you're industrial business people. Research the product, ask them what the emission designator is. Listen, if you're buying something and you ask the salesperson, what's the emission designator? And they go, I don't know, look it up. That's a warning sign. They should know the emission designator of the products they're selling, because in the future, it'll be more and more important as we do more and more sharing and more advanced technologies are being deployed in the vans. This is, as I said to people, the emission designator is the DNA of this. It tells us everything, whether it's data, voice, combo, frequency modulated, which most of them are, and analog or digital. So we'll have this, I assume we'll have this on this. These are the, if you're doing an emission designator that comes out like 9.7 G, something's wrong. Something wrong.
We will point that out, for sure.
All right. Let me, one more point on this. Most of you should know this. The digit, the number next from the right end, the 7, the 1, the 3, the 1, the 1, the 7, the 3, the 1. The analogs are 3 and 8. There aren't any 8s up there, but the 3 tells you it's analog. The 1, X, 7, 9 are digital emission designators. So next steps.
Next steps.
This is a quote. I've seen this before.
Yes. The first bullet is the quote that we plan on sharing with the commission for hopefully the public notice that will come out soon.
Today,
We're sharing it today?
I've got everybody's approval except
Okay.
one public safety organization.
Okay. So we've had discussions with FCC staff, both Wireless Bureau and Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. So everybody's in sync on what those next steps are. And right now, the FCC has a public notice drafted based off of a conversation. We had conversations over the past week with them, but I had another conversation this morning and they clarified that it's drafted. It's just going through, has to go through multiple approval levels within each bureau. And then I think, Liz, probably correct me if I'm wrong. I think it actually has to go up through the chairwoman's office.
I think everything has to be blessed by the chairwoman.
Yeah.
That's what they said.
Go ahead, Liz.
That's what they said.
It wasn't clear as to whether they actually had it drafted or not. So the conversation I had this morning is they said that it actually has been drafted. And I'm like, well, I guess they've had 2 years to draft it.
Well,
so.
but then you ask them, it says,
But I said, I was like,
what about our input?
So to add to this, at the NWCC annual meeting last week, the NWCC asked the FCC representatives that were there on a panel if it would be helpful if we provided language for the public notice about
Pre-coordination thing.
what the coordinators agreed to, which is related to a pre-coordination window, much like we did with Sprint Vacated and EBGB. So the coordinators basically can review all the applications that they have in-house and get everything in order. So there are no mutually exclusive applications being submitted to the commission. So in this case, with the interstitials being introduced, there's going to be a 30-day, up to a 30-day window, and it's a pre-coordination window to allow all the coordinators to review and recommend frequencies to their applicants and share the information on the back end between all the coordinators to be able to review it, make sure that we're not overlapping at all, which the commission refers to as mutually exclusive applications. And assuming that all houses are in order and there are no mutually exclusive applications that need to be addressed, which we find very unlikely, then we can submit it to the commission. And what was agreed to amongst all the coordinators, and the FCC even agreed to it, is that if the coordinators find that we don't need the entire 30-day period and it's less than that, it could take 5 days, it could take 10. As long as all the coordinators are on the same page and mutually agree to it, we can actually start submitting them to the commission sooner than the 30 days.
Initially, EWA was not in favor of any special language on a pre-coordination process because we do not believe that there will be a lot of instances of mutual exclusivity.
Right.
This is a mature band. At this point, I don't think there's not a lot of
There's
12 and a
not
half kilohertz lying around.
And there's not a flood of applications like there were with the other filing
And
windows.
the normal processes that are in play today, 5-day notice, right?
Okay.
Would work in this instance.
Right.
The public safety community coordinators were very concerned. Now they have their concerns. I'm not quite sure the basis of their concerns, but they shouldn't fear business industrial folks in there because we can't get to them anyway. Because, and I don't know what their concern was, but they actually were suggesting a freeze. They said we should suggest to the commission to freeze 25 kilohertz channels. At which point, Robin and I stood up and go,
Absolutely not.
absolutely not. You cannot, freezes are a bad word here at EWA.
Yeah.
And
we all know that when the commission freezes
Yeah.
something, it takes them a decade or
how
more
do you know
to
they won't?
lift it.
They said, we'll lift the freeze
Right.
next month.
Right.
And and they go, but what year? Right. So no, you cannot give them freeze on this. And we convinced the public safety people, one after not yelling at them, but saying, EWA is adamantly opposed to this. We will not sign on to anything that suggests there's a freeze. But the 25 kilohertz, I said, there's no difference. I said, even public safety people will go to you and say, I want an 800 channel. They're not going to go, I only want a 12 and a half, or they're just give me a channel. So you cannot prejudice applications for the incumbents that have 25 while you guys are all concerned about 12 and a half mutually exclusive applications. Makes absolutely no sense to us. We did get a little vociferous about our opposition, and they eventually said, okay. And we said, and we compromised on
We did.
Okay,
We didn't think there needed to be a pre-coordination window at all.
at all, but.
We thought our normal procedures that we use every day
Yeah.
that none of you even see work just fine.
Out of the
And
goodness of our heart, we said, okay, public safety.
We fell on our
We
sword
fell on our sword.
once again.
And we don't know when the public notice is going to incorporate our language
Right,
and when it's going to be issued.
right.
Maybe Liz can weigh in. I think it's anywhere between May 1 and December 31.
The conversation I had this morning said we should see something before the end of the year. And I was like, well,
That's good.
didn't they say that, Liz, in 2020?
2022 is the year.
So I said to Mark, I go, it's lucky number
There
13.
you go. Next, okay. So I think it's time for questions, Madam President.
It is. Before I see that we do have a few questions, but before you read the questions out so Mark and I can answer them. Most of you know the team of Spectrum advisors here at EWA that handle 800 megahertz, but if not, here's the crew and their contact information. And of course, you can always call Mark or myself, and we'd be
Ooh,
glad.
should call you.
Actually, should call me.
Yeah,
Although maybe Mark will start processing applications. I don't know.
yeah, you never know. You never know.
All right, Andrea, what do we got?
All right, we've got 4 questions. We'll start with, what is LMCC's position on licensees with multiple emission designators? Many licensees haven't deleted their older analog emission designator after migrating to DMR or P25.
Great question.
Can I weigh in here? Because this one.
Yes, of course, of course.
Time. I mean, the whole purpose of this is to create more spectrum opportunities.
Right.
And I absolutely agree. Lots of people just leave their wideband emissions on there as a protection. And I said, well, that defeats the purpose of this. And it seems to me, Commission now has on its Form 601, when you go to renew a license, you have to certify that that's the system you're operating. And I would argue, if you're no longer using wideband emissions on your system, and you leave them on there when you renew your license or modify your license, I don't think you're compliant with the commission's rules. So I would encourage people to, I mean, EWA is not the FCC police, except in some areas, but I think, the whole point of this is we're not getting any more spectrum. And if you're already making more efficient use of it, and if the adjacent channel can use it without causing interference to you, you got to get out of the road.
Liz, we might even start during the process, because we're working on this. We're going to have a proposal on how all licensees need to confirm what they have, probably twice within 10 years. But that's another webinar. But if we need a frequency and the adjacent channel user has 20K, 14K, 7K, and 4K, which is not even compatible with each other, we will probably call that person, and our duty as a frequency advisory committee go, which one is it? I doubt that you're operating that 20 FO analog 20 kilohertz bandwidth channel at 800, since the life of that one expired 7 years ago. And so we're probably going to certify it, assuming you're not operating on it. We'll get an answer.
Yeah,
Sure.
as I say, I think when you file an application with the commission and you leave it on there, you're telling the commission that's how you're operating. And I think that that's not an accurate representation of your system.
We are in violent agreement with
No, I know we are.
you.
All right, second question. With respect to the red on the coordination process where there's an or statement, is this true only for BILT channels or is to be accepted later? Public Safety Bureau does not support the contour test without also getting an LOC.
Listen, Robin knows more about it than I do, but public safety has more rules and processes than they seem to be fine with it. We're not so fine with all additional kind of layers, but the green, yellow, and red, I think is still applicable, at least in the rules for public safety, correct?
It's applicable to the entire 800 megahertz band. So
Right.
yes, public safety is included in that. And the red that was on that slide, again, was anybody where it was less than 55 miles away from your proposed site. You know, the rules that have been in place for many years for the 25 kilohertz channels for co-channel is letter of consent or waiver to get closer. The new rules apply the matrix to allow you to get
For
closer
adjacent channel.
for
only.
adjacent channel
On
only
adjacent channel only.
or consent. So that's applicable to public safety. If public safety coordinators are processing or certifying in a different manner, that's not,
Okay,
Known to me
let me
at this
do, I suspect that's one
but I'm not
coordinator.
surprised by it.
I'm not, I suspect that's one public safety coordinator, not all of them. If you run into problems with 800 public safety coordination, you should send them to us. And we have a business arrangement with Collaborative, mutually very good agreement. They're wonderful people. We work with IMSA and IAFC and FCCA, whose coordination policies are rigid, but not quite as rigid as some others in the public safety community.
All right, another question. Can you explain the DBUF with parentheses XX convention?
No.
No.
I'm sorry. I learned that a long time ago. When you're asked, you're testifying on Capitol Hill and they
Don't
ask
make
you,
it up.
if they ask you a question, you go, do you understand? You go, no, Mr. Chairman, I do not. But I will get you an answer within 48 hours.
Yes.
So I need to see that question.
Yeah. So Andrea, if you know who that's from, let's
Yeah,
sidebar on that.
Yeah, I don't want to make
I
anything
do,
up.
and I will share. And
Thank you.
the final question I'm going to combine into one, and then I'm going to go check the chat to see. Oh, I think we got another question as well. Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
anyway, the next question is, what's the process to begin a filing via EWA for this opportunity? And should we call the coordinators directly?
So the process is, yes, you can call any of the folks that are on the current slide, and they can get with you as to where your sites are and everything. We can prepare the application and put it into our system, into our queue.
Do we have applications now?
Or we do have applications now. Or you can also use CEVO if you have a CEVO account, and you can prepare it and submit it through CEVO, which is our application portal that will also get to this 800 megahertz team that's listed on the slide.
Yeah, you don't need to overwork.
We would be glad to prepare.
Yeah,
for you.
just, like I said, there's a lot, it's the tip of the iceberg. You do is get us the application. We don't even need that.
Just the
So we
parameters.
need, I'll just make this up. We need 5 channels on Black Mountain outside of San Francisco and here's the emission designators and who's it from, and that's enough for us to get going.
Right.
One last question, and then there are two chat that I need to address.
Okay.
We'll address one. Isn't this the matrix process what you have been using for UHF centralized trunking for quite some time?
An easier one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easier.
Yeah, no, there is a matrix that
It's the
we
same
use,
methodology with the
but
reciprocal
it only
analysis.
has like 3 things vertically and 3 things horizontal in the UHF, not 20 and 20. This is on a magnitude of like 20 times more. But it's sort of an expansion of what's used at 450. You're
Right.
correct.
But I think
You're
it's
correct.
more complicated because at 450, we no longer have 25 kilohertz bandwidth channels. So the protection.
Exactly.
Right.
I don't even know why we have that thing at 450 anymore anyway, but I'm not so sure the benefit is worth a slide anymore, but that's another discussion with the coordinators.
And the final question is, can't the listed designator be deceiving? I operate an NXDN trunk system, very narrow, and I was told I could operate a 3.125 NXDN channel at the center and 6.25 above and below center if I included all the following. And we have a list of emission designators here, which I can
Yeah,
read
no,
to you.
you
There's a
can.
16K, 20K, 4K, 8K.
Wait a minute, that's confusing the question. If somebody's using 4K, which is NXDN
Right.
technology, Kenwood or ICOM, that's perfectly fine, and you can put multiple ones of them inside a single 25 kilohertz channel. But the emission designator, I believe, has to show that you're occupying more than 4 kilohertz.
Right.
You can't, otherwise you're going to get people on top of you. You got to tell us exactly what the emission designator is for 3-4 kilohertz for 4K technology at 800.
Which is probably why they referenced the fact that they were also including the 16K
You can
I mean,
do-
we've
you-
seen that.
That's fine.
on the 25.
But when you apply the matrix, we're going to go up against the 16K, not the 4K. Because the 16K, with the 25 kilohertz channel, we know if you got 3 4s, you probably got space between the 4s. You're probably occupying 15.5 kilohertz of the 25 kilohertz channel, not just 4. And that needs to be represented on the license, or we won't pick it up. Right, so you gotta have a fair,
It won't be
accurate presentation of the technology
Right.
on your license at 800. Listen, the same thing applies for turbo, motor turbo and XDN. People try to do multiple 7Ks. Okay, but you got to give us a emission designator that shows that you're operating multiple 7Ks. Same for NXDN. I'm using 4 NXDNs. Good. Tell us what the emission designator is so that we can properly coordinate this. I don't know whether that quite answers the question, but I'm happy to have a more detailed conversation on how best to accomplish that with the party that posed that question.
There are no more questions, but I
What are
do
the-
want to make the comment to answer one person's chat that this webinar is being recorded and we will make available a copy of the recording and you will be notified when it is available.
And is that all that's in the chat?
That is all that, I just got one more chat and that is a thank you. So there are no
Our
more
pleasure.
Our
questions.
pleasure.
Our pleasure.
I sent, no, not really.
We thank everybody for attending.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for being on this.
Yeah.
And listen, you might go home and say, I need a drink after that, you know? So if you have more questions, you have an interest in this,
Give us a call.
just email us, text us, call us. We're here to help you through it.